So I'm going to talk about good graphs versus bad graphs. And I did mention earlier in the videos that there was a bad graph in the presentation. And there are 8 methods for making a graph misleading. And these methods should be avoided at all costs unless you are trying to actually mislead an audience, which, believe it or not, happens a lot. Surprise, surprise there. So first, graphing or selecting an inappropriate statistic that may not be representative of your population or may not actually have any relevance to what you're actually talking about, and you just want to have a pretty graph that shows something. Omitting a 0 on the relevance scale, you need to show where, you start and end. Manipulating the scale, using 2 dimensions to emphasize a one-dimensional difference, careless combination of categories in a bar graph, inaccuracy in relative lengths of bars in a graph. That's why they all must be equal. Whoopsie. That is not the pen tool. So, equal. Okay, bias, distortion, or embellishment, or unclear labeling. There's also things to be avoided, such as chart junk. Chart junk is unnecessary things in a graph that clutter a graph or make it intentionally misleading, such as 3D effects like that pie graph all the way back in the beginning. It was in 3D. Completely unnecessary. 2-dimensional works just fine. You don't need the bells and whistles. The bells and whistles are usually meant to detract and make people look at how pretty the graph is as opposed to what the content of the graph is. Unnecessary labels is another kind of example of chart junk. Let's look at this link below. Maybe it'll actually let me open it up. I want an arrow. See if it'll let me. Oh, it won't let me. That's okay. I got it on my desktop. Yeah, sure, why not? So let's go to this link. Control click. Oh, shit. Okay, so let's look at some good and bad graphs. Here's an example of a good graph because it has a clear title, clear labels on the X and Y axes. It's missing an axis down here, but we really don't need it because, it's a bar of male and bar of female, whereas the class is 60% male and 40% female. Basic rules of drawing good graphs and relevance. You can read these at your leisure. I will include this in the work to read. It's important to know that graphs are only as good as the data they display. And no amount of creativity can produce a good graph from dubious data. Okay, so you got to make sure your data is good and strong and your statistics are good and strong in order to have a good graph. Content is important. If you are using very small amounts of data, there's no point for a graph. We can grasp the, values. This graph is really hard to read because it's got labels on both axes that really don't make any sense. It's really hard to read this graph. It's very convoluted. There's a lot of chart junk here. We don't want this. Here's another bad graph. I can't even tell what's going on. It's supposed to be 0 to 100%. The company cafeteria was used 9 out of 10 employees during the fiscal year 1949. Do we even need this picture? No. This is a good graph because it's clear. It has clear axes labeled. It has a nice legend, and it's very legible. So this is a good graph. It's important to talk about complexity. Why are you not scrolling? Okay. Graphs should be no more complex than the data which they portray. You don't need irrelevant decoration, color, 3D effects. In this graph, this is a horrible graph because it's in 3D. It's got two colors, which actually might be relevant, but the 3D effects are kind of distracting and kind of hard to read. So if we look down here in this area, the author of the slideshow, or the teacher, made a new graph showing the exact same thing, 1972, 1973, 1974, 1975, and so on, in a 2D format with two colors, showing the difference between the earnings and the dividends per share with dollars. This is a much easier to read graph, not a lot of chart junk, a lot easier to read than its counterpart up here. This graph, oh dear Lord, what is going on here? Okay, here we have 3D effects. We have a varying scale, which I don't think you can see. Let's try and zoom in on that varying scale. Oh, zoom out. Okay. There's 5 values. Whoa, 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 whoa. Slow your roll, computer. So, really, this just doesn't tell us anything. And what's really, really sad is that it's from American Education magazine. Fail. So, here's a much simpler graph that tells us so much more. Percent of total enrollment age 25 and older. Much easier to read, much more friendly, gets right to the point. Graphs should not provide a distorted picture of the values they portray. It can be deliberate or accidental. Like I said, unless you're trying to screw it up, you really should avoid these things. Here's another, the same thing, same graph. A lot easier to read, although I would probably go with this one as opposed to this one, because the bars we really don't need. There's not much difference there. It's just a whole bunch of rectangles. So this one really shows a nice difference in age with the frequency not a frequency polygon. It's just a plain old line graph. This one, it's complicated and annoying. Okay, and it lists the faculties between women and men in certain areas of school, and they're using a logarithmic scale. So this scale, like, completely warps the data. It looks like, oh, a certain amount of men, a certain amount of women, but with that scale, it's very, very misleading. So what you should do for that graph is something along the lines of this. Faculty size for the arts, commerce, all of that. If you wanted to do women and men in this one, you could do two colors like this, the horrible graph up here, but this graph is a much more simpler graph. And I would not use a logarithmic scale at all because that's really misleading, and the layman really doesn't know what a logarithmic scale is, and and graphs are really for the layman. So very bad scaling on this author. Bad, bad, bad. Pretty good graphs. I'm going to keep talking about this, but I'm going to make another video. The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, Part 3. Yeah. Ignore this. This is funny stuff. I mean, you can read it, but I'm not going to teach you about it. In this graph, we've got a bunch of pictures, and it's deliberately showing that 1979 is much higher than 1978, but in actuality, it's really not. It only increases about not even by a buck, like 60 cents. The this is the same difference, 61 cents. There should not be this much difference between this barrel and this barrel, but they're trying to make you feel like the gas prices per barrel of crude is like a huge increase between 78 and 79, but there's really not much of an increase. It's 64 cents where this was 61 cents. Here we have 48 cents. No. Yeah, 48 cents. I think. No, that would be 99. So 58 cents. And there's barely a difference here, but, you know, that difference is almost the same here. And it's all around a bad graph. And the sizes of these quote unquote bars are just completely misleading. You have a similar example to this one in your textbook because they use the kind of like the 2-point perspective or horizon fading art perspective here. It completely skews the scale. So again, not exactly a good graph. Is the bottom dollar note roughly half the size of the top one? No, it's like scaled down completely too small. It's not roughly half the size. It's another bad graph, but we can make a better graph from that. So the purchasing power of the diminishing dollar, the president, the year, and the worth. We've already talked about these. Here's some more bad graphs. This one's just really hard to read. There's way too much going on. This graph is a much better representation of that. Here, there's, again, a lot going on, a lot of colors, multiple axes, really, really not cool. But look, we can fix it. And that is enough of those examples. Let's go back to our PowerPoint. So again, avoid chart junk. Don't be misleading. And avoid bad graphs whenever possible. The lecture from that other professor ends with these 3 things, and I'm going to iterate them again to you. If the story is simple, keep it simple. Remember KISS, keep it simple, silly. I don't want to call you guys stupid, so keep it simple, silly. If the story is complex, make it look simple and tell the truth. Don't manipulate the graph or the data. So it's your job to make the 3 types of lies statement, lies, damn lies, and statistics false. You need to stay true to the data. Okay. Another great quote that's in your textbook is, figures don't lie, but liars figure. You can easily misrepresent almost anything with the use of statistics. So it is absolutely your job to be as true to the data as possible. So hopefully those lectures were interesting and to some point entertaining. So yeah. Enjoy. Good luck with this week's work.